Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into our program tonight regarding botanical spirits. I'm Misa Jeffries. I'm Assistant Curator at the Contemporary Art Museum, St. Louis. For our program tonight, we're so lucky to be joined by Neshka Pfeiffer, Museum Curator at the Missouri Botanical Garden, and an expert in botanical and biocultural history. Neshka has taken inspiration from the gardens in Ebony G. Patterson's exhibition on view at CAM, and tonight she'll discuss the social impacts of the production and distribution of plant-based spirits. So Neshka is going to give a talk for about 25 minutes, and afterward we will open it up to questions from you all. Please use the Q&A function to type in your questions, and we'll do our best to get to all of them before we wrap up at 7:30. I'm going to begin by providing an introduction to the exhibition and the series. Regarding is a series of programs designed to use the exhibitions on view at CAM as a way to dig deep into one specific topic. We take a theme from the exhibition, we pull it out, and then we explore it in a wider cultural field. So tonight's program is informed by the artwork and exhibition of Ebony G. Patterson and her exploration of the garden as both a symbol and a physical space loaded with meaning. So to get us started, I wanted to share a video walkthrough of the exhibition for anyone that has not seen the show yet. So let me get that started. Ebony G. Patterson was born in Kingston, Jamaica. She attended Edna Manley College in Kingston for her undergraduate studies and Washington University in St. Louis for her MFA. She now lives and works between Chicago and Kingston. Patterson makes large-scale works and immersive installations. Her exhibition at CAM consists of all new works, which you're seeing here. Within many of these gardenscapes, Patterson includes symbols of transformation. We see peacocks, snakes, flowers, butterflies. These are items that evolve and bear witness to the cycle of life and death. Patterson cultivates this cyclical idea that we come from the earth, we exist on the earth, and we return to the earth. And as such, the garden is a site of life, death, and mourning. As you can see, the surfaces of Patterson's works are filled with materials associated with beauty or wealth, including tapestry, jewelry, glitter, and beading. These materials are enticing, they encourage us to look closer. And in a way, these lush surfaces become tools or ways to sort of trap us physically, psychologically, and emotionally in these seductive compositions. And then with a deeper look, beneath the vegetation, Patterson has planted discarded shoes and clothing, images of fragmented body parts, and used children's toys. These items, in a way, subtly evoke notions of violence and loss of life. Black bodies are slowly exposed beneath the plant life. The garden here serves as a kind of post-colonial symbol of a violent past that is never fully buried, not really over, and barely visible. Patterson's works compel us to bear witness, to look, to remember. People become memorialized in her gardens, and each piece is a kind of marker for the overlooked and forgotten. As much as the garden is a metaphor in her work, the garden is also an actual physical space, a natural but cultivated setting. It has historically been a space defined by class and wealth. The flower garden especially is decorative, it's frivolous, and a luxury for those who have time to cultivate it. Decorative gardens have stood as symbols of leisure around the world since colonial times, and that association continues today. Having the space to grow plants is limited for those with less access to resources. So our program tonight takes Patterson's focus on the garden and zeroes in on the complex histories of cultivated plants. Just like in the artist's works where you need to look a little closer to see what's hidden beneath the surface, tonight, we're going to focus on these plant-based alcohols that many of us consume and probably don't give much thought to: gin, whiskey, and rum. We'll dig a little deeper and talk about the social impacts and histories of oppression related to producing and distributing these spirits. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Neshka Pfeiffer, again, Museum Curator at the Missouri Botanical Garden here in St. Louis. Neshka, thank you so much for joining us. Feel free to unmute yourself and turn on your video. I'm going to bring your presentation up now. I'll let you take it away.
Nisa, thank you so much. Thanks so much to CAM for inviting me to participate this way, and also to Ebony G. Patterson for creating these amazing works that are on view at CAM. For those of you who are local to St. Louis, I highly recommend getting to see them in person. Her work inspired the premise of how I'm presenting this evening on looking at these spirits, specifically rum, gin, and whiskey. We're going to stick with the American hemisphere to talk about. As you learn a little bit more about how these were made and sort of the history of these drinks and these alcohols, what does this, how were these in fact used as tools of oppression in a variety of ways? And we'll talk about potentially reclaiming them towards the end of the talk. So one of the things I wanted to focus on is also like what alcohol is. It's been actually around, and humans have been making it for millennia. It's a safe drinking liquid. It also is used as a religious libation. And our earliest hominid ancestors are probably, eating fermented berries, fruits that would be growing on in trees. All of these things all come from plants. And we're going to have a little primer here on what actually distilled alcohols are. A lot of people might be familiar with beer and wine. You need to have a grain, or with wine, you have grapes, and you just ferment them. They age, and then eventually they become the alcoholic drinks of beer and wine. When it comes to distillate, however, distilling is in fact comes from the Latin word to drip or trickle down, and that's a result of the actual process of creating this concentrated alcohol. To the right, you'll see the kind of the sort of bulbous container. That is the pot. That, in fact, is what has to be filled with an already alcoholic mixture. So a fermented mash, some type of alcohol that already exists. And what happens is, as it gets cooked, you have to heat it up and it boils. The alcohol, in fact, because that is lighter than water, it will actually start vaporizing. And as it rises in the top of the pot, you can see sort of that conical shape. It will gather, and then it'll move through the tube at the top. And as it comes back down, it actually is cool. That coil is set in cold water. And in fact, that then makes the vapor become liquid again. And that alcohol is eventually comes and becomes liquid, and then eventually leaves the bottom part of the still. The first thing that actually comes out of that product is actually called the heads. The heads are quite toxic. You don't ever want to drink those. Those, in fact, can kill you or have you go blind. The rest of the pot, is the remainder of that alcohol, is what we would know as whatever the alcohol is. And we're going to talk about the different plants that make the different alcohols, but I just wanted to make sure everybody knew what the distilling process was like. So the next slide, please. We're going to talk about sugarcane first. Sugarcane it's probably is an extremely old domesticated plant. It has its origins in Polynesia, most likely in New Guinea. Humans have actually been moving sugarcane around for quite some time. Sweetness is something that the human palate really desires. And so it, in fact, traveled as a result of people to Indonesia, to the Philippines, to northern India, many thousands of years ago. So it most likely grew at some point. They believe, scientists believe it is about 8,000 or so years old in terms of a plant that has been moving around. By 800, the year 800 before the Common Era, India and China were actually cultivating a form of sugar. They would boil the sugarcane. They knew at this point this is how they had to extract it. And then over the course of the next few centuries, sugarcane use reached Africa. It also is known, and oddly enough, we are sort of understand refined sugar as being an extremely a difficult product for us to ingest sometimes, right? We have a lot of us have a little bit of might have a sugar addiction, but fresh sugar cane, it can actually be quite beneficial to your health, and it's still eaten in quite a few cuisines around the world today. You can boil it, you can suck on it. It's actually got a lot of nutrients in the body, and kind of like an energy drink, and it can keep you hydrated. It's also known medicinally as being able to treat skin problems, or in fact be something that would be effective for wounds for sure. So how did sugarcane become rum? We're going to have the next slide, please. Rum and rhum agricole are two different drinks that are made from fermented sugarcane product. So rum, what we are most familiar with, is actually a fermented drink made from a waste product. Rum has a very complicated history and a bit cruel as well, and we'll talk about that shortly. But basically, sugar has been, as I mentioned, has been getting grown around the world. During the ages of extreme shipping and exploration, which would be the 16th, 17th centuries. And we know that that's when the Americas started being settled and colonized. And we can, of course, everyone thanks Christopher Columbus for that. Sugarcane was known to be an extremely resource necessary plant to grow. And so it eventually made its way to the Caribbean, and because of the hot climate, it was totally perfect to grow there. And in order to refine the plant to make it into that crystal white product that we know of as sugar, you actually end up creating this waste product, which is molasses. And it was most likely enslaved peoples who were working in the plantations who figured out that it could be fermented and in fact then also distilled and turned into what we call rum. Rhum agricole is a French word. It basically means that you're actually using fermented sugarcane juice directly. And that is what is a slightly different product. So it can also be aged just like rum can. The Caribbean island of Martinique is quite renowned for rhum agricole, but you can find it in several other Caribbean nations, in Haiti too, I believe. You often can find it. So both of these products, we're sort of going to talk a little bit more about rum than rhum agricole, but I wanted to make sure that everybody knew that these are the two different alcohols that in fact you can make from sugarcane. There's a few more, of course, but we're going to focus on these this evening. Next slide, please. So the pieces of plants on paper that you see on your screens there, those are actually specimens from the garden's herbarium. The Missouri Botanical Garden has an herbarium of plants. At this point, we're numbering over 7 million that are stored and preserved as dried specimens on these sheets. And so you're going to see all of the plant specimens this evening that are all of the drinks that we're going to be talking about presented in this way. And what you're seeing is in fact sugarcane. You can see its long, stocky quality, and that sort of funny, fuzzy flower or set of flowers is in fact what we call an inflorescence, which is a bunch of flowers. And that is actually what sugarcane, if it's grown to its full height and allowed to flower, will in fact look like. You'll see a small picture in the lower right-hand side of, in fact, a full sugarcane field in Louisiana, which is one of the states in which sugarcane is grown today. And usually sugarcane farmers do not actually want sugarcane to get to the point where it's flowering, because it reduces the water in the stalk and makes it a lot more difficult to cultivate. Today, sugarcane accounts for about 79% of the sugar that's produced in the world, and the rest is from sugar beets. And so for the most part, sugarcane you'll find around in tropical areas and subtropical regions. Sugar beets can be grown in more northern areas, but it's over 90 countries, in fact, can grow sugarcane. And for the most part, I believe Brazil is one of the largest producers of our refined sugar that we know today, which can also be used for other things too. Tends to be baking and other kinds of products. One of the big struggles was in understanding actually how important sugar was as a commodity. It used to be, because it was so rare, in the early European medieval period, people would very rarely be able to have more than, a teaspoonful of sugar. It was that dear, it was that rare. And so the drive to have sugar as a commodity, as a good, as a food product, a spice, was so intense that was one of the things fueling the exploration and the colonization of what became after the Columbian exchange took place. And in fact, Christopher Columbus was in fact married to a woman who was a part of a sugar growing family in Madeira. So he already knew that the goal was to try and find another way to make this crop bigger and be able to add more Spanish abilities to make money from sugarcane. We're gonna, next slide, please. I wanted to make sure to mention the sugarcane history a little bit from Jamaica, since Ebony Patterson actually originally hails from Jamaica. What you're looking at is a map that was a part of a book called The Civil and Natural History of Jamaica by Patrick Brown. And the first Caribbean island that's documented to actually to grow sugarcane was Barbados, which still has one of the oldest rum producing companies. I think the Mount Gay distillery is one of the oldest rum companies in the world. But Jamaica actually is also very well known for growing sugarcane, was a source of sugarcane. It actually had some really great growing conditions because of the tropical climate. And originally, Columbus never made it to this particular island, but his son Diego did. And by 1513, Spanish farmers had come and brought sugarcane with them to start planting it. You'll see a little tiny orange triangle at the top of the map there on the northern side of the island. That's actually Sevilla La Nueva, was the first sugarcane growing experiment. One of the issues is that sugarcane is such a dangerous crop. It's actually quite difficult to harvest. You need to have machetes or something really before machinery was invented to industrialize the process. And in fact, the Spanish subjugated the Taino native peoples that were in Jamaica and forced them to work the sugarcane plantation. Unfortunately, it was a pretty brutal situation. The Taino also, unfortunately, received exposure to European diseases, and pretty much within a few years, the whole population was gone. And so the Spanish kind of gave up in continuing to grow sugarcane there, but there is actually some archaeological evidence in Sevilla Nueva today where they've actually done digs on the sugar mill that was existing there. Once the British were basically acquired the island, they then decided to set up a full scale plantation system, and they ended up importing tens of thousands of enslaved Africans. The trade in sugar and rum would pretty much depended on enslaving Africans from West Africa and then bringing them to the Americas, either to the Caribbean or to the South, to grow these really labor-intensive crops. And so Jamaica was one of the Caribbean islands that received these enslaved workers. And so by the end of the 18th century, the enslaved Africans outnumbered Europeans in Jamaica by a ratio of 10 to 1. Next slide, please. To give you a little bit of a sense of some of the heat and intensity of the work, what you're looking at is a drawing from a print from 1823 of the interior of a boiling house. And the artist depicts the operations of a sugar boiling house in Antigua. And you can see the enslaved people working here on the left. What they're doing is they're skimming impurities of the liquid sugar surface with very large ladles. And to the right, you'll actually see white merchants evaluating the brown muscovado sugar, which was also one of the types of sugar that they could sell. The temperatures in the boiling house could be quite unbearable. The copper containers were all placed over a large furnace. The temperatures were extremely high. After the sugarcane was harvested, its liquid was extracted and poured into the copper containers. And as the liquid would go through the refining process, the cane liquid would move to each successively smaller container until all of the impurities were removed. And this kind of work was really exhausting, required a lot of dexterity, and it tended to be that men were assigned to these specific jobs. Please, next slide. And so one of the common mentions in the trade of rum and people. It also is often called the triangular trade, where people were enslaved in the west coast of Africa and then brought to the Americas west, and then the goods that would be made in the Americas were sent to Europe. And then those goods would in fact also then get sent back down to West Africa, where the slave traders would trade those goods for more enslaved people. And in fact, often alcohol was one of these currencies. So I've highlighted in the map, if you can see sort of little brown kind of underlinings where you can see where rum and molasses were moved around. Rum was distilled, molasses would be sent to the North American continent as well. New Englanders were also able to distill molasses there into rum. However, the Caribbean rum product was considered some of the best. And so often that would go directly to Europe to then be used for consumption and then also be used as a good. One important thing to remember is that this wasn't just the forced labor of these people was not something that caused controversy at the time. I wanted to make that clear. And please, next slide. And this excerpt from this particular long poem, it's called Pity for Poor Africans, was from a pamphlet that was printed by the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. And people knew then, in the 17th and 18th centuries, that it was enslaved people who were making this addictive good, not just sugar, but also rum. And the last couple of lines of that poem, particularly, I pity them greatly, but I must be mum, for how could we do without sugar and rum, especially sugar, so needful we see. What? Give up our desserts, our coffee and tea? It's interesting to learn that, for me, it was particularly to see something, this kind of published material that would focus, that people knew that if they would be willing to boycott that sugar and rum, that potentially more people their lives would be saved and they would not be put through such excruciating circumstances of being enslaved on plantations. One key thing is that as the 18th century turned, sugar kind of had a few economic issues happen, specifically temperance, which is the movement to abolish the use of alcohol and alcoholism, which I haven't really addressed, was certainly something that was affecting societies. The more alcohol that was being sent and made and people were imbibing could be quite destructive in very large quantities. And these types of issues were something that was also fueling the discussion about the abolition of the slave trade as well. One other interesting thing is, because these plants, as they were moving from continent to continent, would continually be hybridized, could also be put at risk. And there was actually, in fact, a sugarcane blight that just made it difficult to grow sugarcane. And so the product was actually in competition with sugar beets, which were rising, and more people wanted to be able to farm sugar in Europe or in northern regions where sugar beets were a little bit more easy to grow. And so that kind of competition also kind of drove down the need for the plantations in which enslaved people were working. So together with a lot of other factors, it eventually sort of slowed down the need for this kind of huge, massive labor resource. And in fact, that today sugar is still a very difficult industry to participate in, and it's certainly something to consider when you're drinking rum today. Sugar is also the workers in different countries don't necessarily have safe conditions or potentially a lot of rights. And so it's certainly something to continue to remember when you are imbibing any rum. Next slide, please. The second set of alcohols we're going to talk about, or gin and Genever. Gin is known as actually a flavorless, it's meant to start with a flavorless distillate, and it can be made from any kind of grain, but it's really the flavorings of the different herbs and spices that go in it that give you the flavor that we call the drink that we call gin. Genever is in fact the predecessor to gin. The Dutch were big fans of juniper. Juniper is where we get the word gin and Genever. And in fact, juniper was very well known as being a kind of a healthful medicinal plant. And so that was used to flavor lots of alcoholic concoctions that would be used as medicine. But eventually, as the Dutch, who were very well known for shipping and trade in spices, specifically around Southeast Asia, where a lot of these spices come from, they ended up being able to get people interested in the exposure of drinking Genever, because they would make it in the Netherlands, it would be traded for goods. It would be traded for people as well, not just rum. And also more and more people would sort of get exposed to drinking it wherever they would be meeting Dutch traders or Dutch people. And so eventually the English decided that they really liked this drink, and then they started distilling it on their own and making it a little bit lighter, so not quite the same type of flavor. We're going to talk about juniper next in the next slide. Juniper is the most... it's really kind of the key ingredient, but not every gin that you taste will actually be juniper forward, as they call it. It grows throughout Asia, Europe, and North America, and it's used to flavor a variety of things, but specifically alcohol in this case, but it's very, very good medicinally for different kinds of organ ailments, like specifically kidney problems or liver problems. And so often when juniper was added to alcohol, it would then enable people to have that kind of medicinal quality more quickly delivered to the bloodstream. And that's one of the reasons why medicine was often used alcoholic concoctions or alcoholic bases, is because you didn't actually have to ingest it. It could go directly to the bloodstream. Some people, in fact, also thought juniper could cure plague. That's not necessarily been proven at all. Next slide, please. Were some of the other spices that are important to also talk about, particularly for gin, that are key, are coriander, angelica, bitter orange, and orris root. You'll see a list of a few others on that slide. In the next slide, please, I think. They have all of these that are listed there are depending on the recipe of the gin house. Every gin maker can actually, they sort of vary the recipes. But when you're looking at coriander, that's got a lot of health benefits. It also is grown from in a variety of places. Angelica is also, it's sort of been a nomadic plant. It started in Syria, most likely, but then it quickly spread to Europe. And so a lot of different European cultures were using it for medicinal purposes. Angelica is the bitter orange is also an important plant. That too is traveled around the world a bit. One really great thing about the herbarium specimen that you see is that we actually had slices of that bitter orange.
Just chiming in to say we're having a little technical difficulties, but we'll be right back online. I see Lisa coming back now.
Okay, great. Should I wait till we get, there we go. Very good. And one last plant that I just want to mention was the iris. If you can potentially go back to the previous slide. The lower right-hand side, that there's actually a flower, which most people know of as a beautiful blooming flower, the iris, that's root, or orris root, is actually aged and also used to spice gin. It's also used in perfumes, so you'll often see it. The specific species of plant, though, that tends to be used in gin is Iris pallida, and so that's the one that I've got depicted there. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the Dutch were extremely avid traders, unfortunately, in people as well as in spices. They, in fact, would they would colonize certain regions of the Southeast Asia, particularly in terms of spices, and to get control of the spices, because that was a currency and power that they really wanted. And in fact, ended up those kinds of political conflicts would lead to wars, and particularly between the Netherlands and Spain. And so as these different islands changed hands, often the control of the spice trade also changed hands. These kinds of governmental issues of it would also sort of trickle down into everyday society. And the next slide, please. We've actually got an interesting image that features a drawing that was by an artist named William Hogarth. And it's a black and white drawing. It's actually a print.
Sorry, we're having a little bit of technical issues on Misa's side.
No problem.
She's going to just log back on, and we'll have your presentation back up in just a sec. Thanks, everybody, for being patient. It wouldn't be Zoom and Mercury retrograde without a little bit of fun.
No problem.
We do, while we're waiting, I mean, these are some really great questions that have come in.
Oh, good.
One
yes.
from Elizabeth that says that you know, they're tough questions, Neshka, that might be beyond what we can answer right now. But Elizabeth has a question about, is there a better or recommended alternative to sweeteners? I'm good with no rum, but no sugar has me paused, with a smiley face.
Oh, that's, yeah, a good question on alternative sweeteners. Because I find that some of them are tough in also, sometimes the first sweetener I would think to turn to is honey, but we all know that with the issues with pollinators and bees, sometimes the supply may not be able to meet the demand of that. For other people, there might be, uh, sweeteners coming from other plants, such as stevia, for example, but not everyone is able to process that either. So that's a really good question. And I think if there was a nutritionist in the audience, they might actually have some better suggestions than I do. But I know that I can only think of like other plants or honey specifically that might work as sweeteners. I wish I had a better suggestion.
There's a similarly challenging question
Yes.
but you got a great answer. Thank you, from Elizabeth, who had asked the original question. There's a follow-up question that says, following up on that question, are there distilleries or producers that ethical consumers should avoid? Any that we should try to support?
Yes, ethical producers of distilled products. Good question. And that's actually something I do want to address a little more generally at the end. But like, I think one of the challenges is finding local distillers. I think if you have a community that, has the market in which distillers are able to produce, and survive economically. I think that's a good thing. Of course, I think it's really good to talk to those distillers and see how they're getting their ingredients, because obviously the grain or the sugar, molasses is coming from somewhere. I think one of the challenges in finding ethical producers is that generally any big name, some of the most famous names of any of these products have all been bought by huge international corporations like Diageo. These owners are very, very, very removed from the actual producers. And I think that adds and obfuscates the whole production problems. And so I think that's one reason why these workers who are, particularly even for sugarcane, are still at such risk of being marginalized and abused. And so I think it's definitely, it's one of those things where you have to also find fair trade projects and programs. I think, trying to find sugar producers that are involved with fair trade programs, I think is really important. The same goes with spices. So there are certainly, NGOs and nonprofits and charities that actually try to highlight these things, and specifically with food. I definitely think you should look to your community. I also think that educating yourself, and I do this too, about who all of the people are who participate in food in your community. And I think it's really important to also look at finding producers who are women and people of color, both. And I think those kinds of it takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy and education on your own parts. And I wish I had more suggestions. I do want to point out that there's another museum called the Museum of Food and Drink, which is headquartered in Brooklyn. They've actually been doing some phenomenal programming recently that I've had the benefit of attending, particularly looking at Native American producers of food and cuisine, as well as African American, and other groups around the country that come from different backgrounds. I think finding and educating yourself is really one of those important things. Again, I wish I had a more concrete answer for you, but I hope that's helpful.
I have one addition to that too, Neshka. That was a great answer. And I'm just going to start my video so I can say hi to everybody. I'm Michelle December. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement.
Thank you, Michelle.
That's just helping out with technology tonight. I'm going to also drop a podcast into the chat that had me thinking about this question. It's a podcast called The Sporkful, and there is an episode called Plantation Rum is Changing Its Name. Is That Enough? So I'm just going to drop that into the chat because that might be helpful to listen to, because they address a lot of these same questions too. Okay, back to you. And Lisa's back too, thank goodness. So back to you, Neshka.
Good. Yes. Thank you. And I just want to follow up. I actually, the Sporkful, I think, is been really a great educational tool for me to learn about a lot of the different societal issues that are in food and in the food industry. And that plantation rum episode is really excellent. Plantation food, but also the company that was calling themselves for plantation rum, which, is a problematic word. So I highly recommend, and thank you, Michelle. That was great. I definitely appreciate that. So Misa, thank you so much. I have a request for just the next slide, if that's okay. Perfect, great. So this illustration that you're looking at is one of a pair. I'm only showing you what is called Gin Lane. This was created by William Hogarth, who was pretty well-known 18th century English painter and artist. He was also an avid printer and turned a lot of his paintings into prints. And so he created this series, Gin Lane and Beer Street. And I didn't show Beer Street because Beer Street is like all glory. Everybody thought beer was much more nutritious and better and healthier for you, but gin was terrible for you. And one of the reasons was because gin was so prolific. Thanks to a Dutch born king, William the Fourth, I believe, who came to become King of England in the Glorious Revolution in the 1680s. He, in fact, was a huge Genever fan. And as a result, as I mentioned earlier, Genever was a very popular drink. The Dutch, a lot of people were exposed to it as a result of coming in contact with Dutch people, Dutch traders, or even fighting wars with the Dutch. They would, find ways to drink together and learn about gin and Genever. And so when he came, he was such a fan of Genever, he wanted it to be distilled. And he actually he ended up disbanding the Distillers Guild. And so pretty much anyone could get a permit to distill and create gin. And so what you're seeing is a society that has been beset by the proliferation of gin. And so I'm William III, there we go, I was wrong, not William IV. So what you're looking at is a woman who's in the center, who's just like completely falling apart, or her child is falling into, falling over there. She's Madame Geneva, who, sort of the bad, negative connotation of a woman who's kind of taken to drink and drinking gin. And so she exemplifies the gin addiction for the most part, with her unkempt appearance. And one of the reasons she's highlighted as this negative feature is because, in fact, some of the most prolific drinkers of gin were women. And so this was a way to sort of chastise women who were enjoying alcohol, because socially it was still not considered as acceptable. Saloons and taverns were supposed to still be the purview of men. And so for women to sort of cross that boundary to be drinking gin was definitely not considered anything that was positive. And so what you also see is that, people are totally sacrificing their food, their drink, they only want gin, and people are pawning their goods. And so this was showing that gin was just had a terrible impact on society. And so one of the other things that's really important to know about alcohol is that since earliest recorded times, alcohol has been legislated and controlled by whatever government has existed. It's very much something that gets taxed. It gets tested, it gets regulated by the government. Even, some of the earliest Mesopotamian tablets are about, people, having beer licenses. So often we're women, frankly. Women have always been involved with producing alcohol. So the Gin Acts that were legislated in between 1729 and 1750 were actually meant to restrict the sale and making of gin. So basically that ability to be able to distill gin was sort of retracted in order to try and control people having access to gin. Of course, what happened was people just started distilling it illegally, which is still mostly a crime in most countries. And here, especially, you're not allowed to distill. But this is also one of the issues why bootleg liquor of any kind is something, it's much less inexpensive. People can make money making it, but it also becomes dangerous because it's not regulated and people can make all sorts of mistakes. And in fact, sometimes also put in other ingredients just so that they can, sell something. And so you'll sometimes hear people drinking, unfortunately, and passing away from contaminated bootleg alcohol. Unfortunately, those Gin Acts did not actually make a difference. They still kept people, hankering after gin. But we had a similar situation happen in the United States, particularly with prohibition. So again, lots of legislation, prohibition of alcohol, and it just made people want to drink more. So next slide, please. We're on our last alcohol here, American whiskey and bourbon. And I'm sticking with American whiskey in bourbon because there's so many different kinds of whiskeys and they have different kinds of ingredients and there's different sort of rules for them. But I wanted to stick with American whiskey because to talk a little bit more about the impact of alcohol just generally in American society. There are several plants that are used to make whiskey. Depends if it's corn whiskey, certain kind of whiskey that is at least 51% corn is bourbon. Bourbon can be limited to growing, being made in Bourbon County in Kentucky, but not necessarily. It really needs to have the ingredient of 51% corn. All of the rest of the mash would have all the other grains that you see, rye or wheat or so forth. And of course, barley and wheat are also made into whiskey. Again, you have to, have these fermented mash and then you put that in a still and what comes out is whiskey. It starts out being a clear drink, a clear liquid, but then as a result of aging in white oak barrels that are usually charred on the inside, that is what imparts the color and that sort of mellower flavor, especially with older whiskeys as well. So we're going to take a quick peek at the plants that are used to make whiskey and bourbon. Corn is actually, what's kind of interesting is that whiskey is, at least American whiskey usually has corn, and corn is the one American grain we're going to be looking at. It originated in the Americas. It was part of the diet of Native Americans historically. Obviously, today it's a global crop. You find it everywhere. It is, besides being edible, it's used for medicinal purposes. And it was also quite cheap and easy to grow. And so there was an abundance of corn, which is why it was quite easy to turn it into a distillate, because you were not taking food out of people's mouths or, out of your family's mouths. You would have access that you could turn into whiskey. Rye, which you see on the right there, is originated in Asia. It's also, it's a slightly different crop compared to the others we're going to be looking at because it tends to be able to be grown in more unfavorable soils. So maybe not as minerally rich. It also can be grown a little bit further north, so it can withstand cooler temperatures in the winter. And it can also be grown at higher altitudes. And so it's quite hardy and quite filling. It's also got a lot of minerals in it, such as magnesium. And so it just often was used as a food, food crop. It would be available to use. Next slide, please. And so the remaining two, barley, another very important plant that would be used for, grain and food and bread specifically. And it eventually was also turned into whiskey. It also is known for being able to be malted. It can actually be processed in such a way that it adds to the flavor. And so you'll see malted barley for whiskey as well as regular barley. That's another kind of desirable whiskey to drink. And then you also have wheat. Wheat is a little bit harder to process for alcohol. The seeds are a little bit more difficult to have they have the protein in the seed takes a little bit more to get out and the sugars in order to process it. So you'll find it as a base alcohol for a lot of things, and not just whiskey. One of the unfortunate things with alcohol also is, besides it being used as a currency, it could also be used to dominate as well. And so in the next slide, you're going to see an image of, this is actually a frontispiece for a book of Gregorian chant that was translated for the Abenaki and the Micmac peoples of Maine. And they had been Christianized at this point in the 1850s. And in fact, it had already been seen how destructive alcohol was to Native American populations. And today, unfortunately, a lot of Native Americans still deal with this in their cultures. And in fact, a lot of Native American reservations in North America have in fact banned alcohol. You're not actually able to find it because of the devastating effects. And this was early on, it was used as a tool. A lot of Native Americans in South America and Central America, they were used to alcoholic beverages. They had corn beer, chicha, but usually mostly North American, Native American nations, they were used to altered states. They would, smoke tobacco, potentially other plants. But this alcohol, especially distilled alcohol, was so potent, it could really affect their ability to make positive decisions, and they were often taken advantage of and manipulated. And so it became quite a terrible tool used by colonizers to take land from Native Americans and to control their populations in a variety of other not positive ways. And so that's one of the other important elements to realize of, it's not just the means of production, but alcohol could potentially also be used as another type of tool of oppression. And so next slide, please. This is one of the last images I've got for you. And what's interesting is that we have the government kind of playing another role here. What you're seeing is it's a later illustration by Currier and Ives of what was called the Whiskey Rebellion from 1794. And this took place because after the war, rural farmers in Western Pennsylvania often were actually had an excess of grain, and they often would they would distill their own whiskey in order to use as currency, because even in 1794, you had sometimes a more sure currency as opposed to printed material, printed money, but you can in fact trade and barter goods with whiskey. A lot of these farmers were not well-to-do. They did not have huge, acreage, but this was a way that they could make money, and they could also more easily ship their product. Grain and beer could in fact go bad. They could spoil, and when you distill an alcohol, it can be quite stable. So unfortunately, the young American nation, and specifically Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, realized that this huge governmental debt took place as a result of the American Revolution. One of the ways to get money would be to tax the alcohol. And so that's exactly what he decided to do, is levy a whiskey tax. And so these specific farmers who were making whiskey sort of lost out on that, because the amounts that they were making, the tax would be quite high in proportion of what they had to pay. And so they in fact decided to protest and rebel, and there were quite a few demonstrations, and eventually George Washington showed up with some militia and some troops, and for the most part was able to peacefully kind of subjugate them. But this kind of political decision of taxation without representation, basically, which is what supposedly the American Revolution was fought for, struck a very hypocritical chord with these people in Pennsylvania. And so they really were very upset and demonstrated. Once the rebellion was suppressed, though, that was about it. I think pretty much they had to deal with being taxed as a result. And so back to the previous questions about how to reclaim these spirits. If we can get to the next slide, please. I think that was one of the important lessons that I really appreciated from Ebony's work, is that, there are all these stories and histories of how people have been able to still use these spirits, or come and tell these new stories and have new product. I think one of the more interesting stories that I learned about recently was the Jack Daniel's whiskey story. And in fact, an enslaved man in Tennessee had in fact taught Jack Daniel's how to make whiskey. And after he was freed, he was able to be hired by Jack Daniel's, where he taught him how to make whiskey. But the unfortunate thing is that the Jack Daniel's family never really properly remunerated the family of the man who taught him. And his name, the man who taught Jack Daniel's how to make whiskey, his name was Nearest Green. And so what's really, and Nearest Green's family worked for the distillery for generations, and I think they still do now. There was a woman who actually understood that this story took place and realized the damage that had been done to the family, especially not being able to be recognized for the work that Nearest Green gave to the Daniels family and distillery. And so she and one of the members of Nearest Green's family, one of his descendants, have actually started a distillery called Nearest Whiskey or Nearest Green Whiskey. My apologies. And so that's a great example of how these are both women of color who are using and highlighting and honoring the legacy of someone who was involved in spirits, who may have been marginalized beforehand, but now at least his descendants can benefit from this, and the proceeds go to the family, particularly to establishing scholarships, so that the continual Green family descendants will be able to benefit from that spirit. I also think, as I mentioned earlier, finding distilleries locally that how they source their materials. I also think it's important, politically, for people to reach out to larger organizations and companies and try and get them to be more transparent, and supporting workers around the world who make these goods that get turned into distilled things that we, you know, enjoy every single day. And I think that's one of the difficult messages. You know, alcohol was created by humans, you know, as a communal libation and something that is meant to celebrate people. And I think it's hard when you learn these histories of, you know, how these things got started and kind of the messy information that you uncover as you learn more. But, you know, if we are to truly reclaim them, ideally people are paid what for the labor that they've put into properly. And then, you know, you feel that each glass that you raised to your family member, whoever you're toasting, you can actually have that intention be strong and positive and something that's a good experience for everyone to enjoy. So that's, so thank you. Thank you so much for letting me tell you the stories.
Thanks, Neshka. I'm just going to pop in to ask one quick question while Misa's kind of transitioning. There was a comment actually from Ramona in saying, that does not look like what we think of corn. And this brings to mind, maybe to form that in a question, do you have thoughts about the availability or familiarity of plants that, you know, the kind of general public has access to in a maybe broader sense, or what this kind of like topic of what's available or what's familiar to us as the general public, and how that might relate to some of these themes about power and production that you've brought up. This is a kind of open, I'm translating the comment into a question, so feel free to answer however you'd like.
Yeah, say that one more time, the question part.
The comment was, this doesn't look like what we think of as corn. And so I'm wondering kind of what you think of when you think about sort of the availability of plant species that are familiar to us as, let's say, the general public. You know, you mentioned there's thousands of specimens in the collection. Right. I'm sure I would recognize a fraction of those as a total layperson. Do you see a kind of relationship between power and this familiarity or that kind of access that we have as the general public to certain breeds of plants or certain types of plant life?
Yes, I think so. I think one of the issues is that because of the scale of production, you know, of these crops, and I think of them firstly, you know, to be crops as food, but eventually, obviously, they get turned into distilled alcohols too. Is, you know, the people who control the seeds are the ones who tend to control the power, and they also, and there's been, you know, as we've moved to the kind of corporatization of agriculture, I mean, over the course of decades now, of course, that power has been removed from the people who are actually farming these things. And so in order to kind of buy into the protections of the agricultural system, you kind of have to use the seeds that these, you know, people are giving to you. And so, and what happens then also is we're in fact creating an insecure system. And so great comment about the corn. And I actually meant to highlight you know, to point out the little ear, but yeah, historically corn or teosinte is this, you know, tiny little thing. It's been hybridized with so many, through so many iterations to create this big, you know, thick, juicy corn that we think of is what you buy and you grow in your garden. And so really that's not what corn looks like. It's this tiny little thing. And so I think in looking at crop security issues and crop sovereignty issues, to go and look at other species of plants that are in those families, but have not been hybridized to such a almost ridiculous degree, in terms of how big they are. It's all about creating huge yield. And so that's why they've been hybridized to look the way that they do and be used the way that they do. So if we go back and look at these species that have not been hybridized, but are still there, and that is true of not just corn, but also potatoes and other types of wheat. And that if we go back and look at those other species, we're actually, and they could potentially still be hybridized, but the genetic diversity would be a little bit broader and not quite limited to just these one species. And, you know, last year at the museum at the garden, I curated a show on the potato. And one of the main reasons the potato blight took place in Ireland in the 1840s is because it was all the same cultivar. And so this one cultivar had this, did not have a resistance to this fungus that ended up blighting it. And frankly, that blight still exists today. And so the more monoculture, our potato crops are, the more difficult it is that this crop is going to survive. And it's the same thing with bananas too. We're just eating one cultivar of banana right now for the most part. So the more diversity we have, the less risk our food system is in. So I think the only way that that can happen is if people from the ground up who technically don't have that power, understand how these crops work and in fact look at them and figure this out, because the big companies should probably be doing this, but doesn't look like they are successfully, they've got this huge machine of what they're growing now, and it takes a lot to invest in these plants.
Thanks, Neshka. Another kind of comment that I'd like to phrase as a question comes from Emma. She says, this makes me think that tequila is also one of those American spirits that also has a troubled past. Any thoughts?
Yes, I can truly say I'm not as familiar with tequila, but tequila was used to make an alcoholic drink before the Spanish came. So the native Mexicans and Central Americans, in fact, would be making, just like they made corn beer, chicha, they would have been making a fermented drink out of any of these other plants. And so it's with the distillation, which really the Spanish bring with them when they come, that it becomes this kind of more strong spirit and a tool of oppression as well. I'm not as familiar, like I said, with that story, but I knowing the subjugation and some of the history that Mexico and the Mexicans went through after the Spanish came, I'm assuming there's probably some not so great stories there.
Thanks, Neshka. There's one more two-part question that's maybe a little too long to answer, so I'm going to pose it, and then if there's like a quick thought you can share with us. If not, maybe we could move the conversation over to our social media channels and we could answer it that way too. So there's actually a follow-up question from Shahal that says, are there any biological limitations for what sorts of plants can be distilled or developed into alcohols? That's one question. Mm-hmm. The other question is, how do you think the development of GMOs, especially in cash crops like corn, will impact distillation and the influence of big, powerful corporation over these markets? So that second one is a doozy of a question, but both great follow-up questions. So if you had a quick thought about either, I'll just pass it over to you, and then after that, Misa will wrap us up.
Yeah, for the first question, in terms of biological limitations, I think you can almost just, as long as something can be turned into an alcohol, you can then eventually distill it. The question is how much sugar is in it. Sugar is really important to the fermenting process. So if a plant doesn't have that much sugar, a lot of grains do, which is what makes them easy to turn into that. But I think, people have made alcohols out of a lot of different things. You just need to get enough of it. And so sometimes you're not able to make enough of it to make it worthwhile, because you need to have a pretty decent sized mash in order even just to get, I think, a liter of distillate. But that's to the best of my knowledge, not being a distiller. And in terms of the development of GMOs, I think, I know there are distilleries who are looking to some of these older strains of corn that were not hybridized to look at them as sources for distillate and for whiskey, for example. And so I think that, I don't know what the GMO will how that plant will have been developed. Like if we're going to look at corn, how will the corn behave, and will that actually be able to be distilled, and how how far will it spread? So I don't know if that's not an answer that either says it's good or it's bad. It's just that what's the quality of the plant that it comes out to be, and will that be workable for distillate? I think also it's possible that a lot of the corn that's already getting turned into alcohol is already GMO corn. Unless someone's telling you that they're getting organic corn or they're getting different species corn, you're probably already getting GMO corn in your whiskey and bourbon. I hope that answers the question.
You got to thank you so much for the answers. Megan wanted to add one thought that tequila and agave harvest is causing the devastation to native bat populations that depend on the plant for food too. So I love that there's lots of great feedback with our attendees too.
And that's a great point. Yeah, pollinators for the wind. Yeah, I think that's thank you for bringing that up, Megan, because I know, I mean, that's true of other crops too, you know, particularly chocolate. Chocolate can only be pollinated by this one tiny little tropical midge. And once that midge is gone, like that's it, you know? So I think those are, the ecosystem of these plants is so important. It's not just the plants themselves. So thank you.
And there's a lot of thank yous coming through to you, Neshka. So with that note of thank you, I'm going to pass it off to Misa to wrap us up for the evening.
Same. I would also like to say a huge thank you to you, Neshka. I'm just overwhelmed by the depth of your knowledge on this topic. And if I could even just capture and retain 10% of what you have said tonight, I would be very happy, very impressed with myself. So I want to say thank you so much for, you know, being so thoughtful about your presentation. And just to kind of tie it together with Ebony's work, I just wanted to say I really appreciate kind of you're bringing these histories to the fore tonight. I think this narrative is really not talked about so much. I honestly didn't know very much about the production and distribution of these spirits. And so I think it's very much in line with, you know, Ebony's work in terms of, you know, these ideas of visibility and invisibility and talking about these issues rather than burying them and just thinking about whose stories are told versus whose are not. So I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful to work with you. And thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. And if you haven't seen the show, it's on view through February. So please come and visit. Ebony is also going to give a talk on November 12th at 6:30 p.m. So I hope you can join us. It'll be on Zoom as well. And until then, just take care of yourselves and have a wonderful Thursday night. Thank you.